What if God was a theory? Not a prayer, not a poem, not a preacher's sermon, but a testable, falsifiable, scientific theory, just like gravity or evolution. It might sound provocative, even offensive to some, but for a growing number of thinkers, physicists, philosophers, and cosmologists, it's a serious and structured question. Can the idea of God be evaluated by science? And if so, does it hold up? Today, we'll explore one of the boldest intellectual confrontations of our time, the hypothesis of God versus the hypothesis of the multiverse. This is not a debate about faith or religion in general. This is about explanatory power. This is about evidence. This is about what best accounts for the universe we live in, its origin, structure, fine-tuning, and even its silence. To evaluate the God hypothesis, we first need to define what we're talking about. Not all ideas of God are created equal. In this video, we'll look at three major conceptions of God, commonly found in philosophy and theology. The passive God, the logical source of all existence. The unmoved mover, the first cause, a being defined through abstract reasoning, detached, unchanging, impersonal. The active God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who creates with purpose, loves with intention, and commands with clarity. This God reveals himself in history, morality, miracles, and perhaps scripture. The emergent God, a more modern, metaphorical idea, God as the sum of universal laws, the principle of order, or even the feeling of awe we experience when staring at a night sky. Less a being, more a pattern, or poetry. Of these three, the passive God and active God are most relevant to our scientific analysis, because they make claims about the nature of reality, and claims can be tested. Science works by proposing theories, ideas about how the world works, and testing those ideas through observation, prediction, and falsifiability. A scientific theory must do more than sound impressive. It must be logically coherent, match observed data, make testable predictions, be simpler than competing explanations, if possible. So, what happens when we treat God like a theory? Does God explain anything? Can we test the idea? And how does it compare to alternative explanations like the multiverse hypothesis, which arises naturally from modern physics? Let's begin with the first type of God, the passive God. The passive God is most famously associated with thinkers like Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and Leibniz. This God doesn't intervene in human affairs. He doesn't part seas, send angels, or answer prayers. He exists as a kind of necessary ground of being, the reason anything exists at all. The arguments for this God are largely a priori, meaning they come from reason, not observation. Here are three of the most well-known. The cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. The argument from contingency. Contingent things, like stars, trees, people, don't explain themselves. So there must be a necessary being that does. The ontological argument. If the greatest conceivable being exists in the mind, it must also exist in reality, otherwise it wouldn't be the greatest. These arguments may be intellectually rich, but do they explain anything about the real world? Many scientists say, no. From a scientific standpoint, a priori reasoning has a poor track record in describing reality. As physicist Sean Carroll argues, a priori reasoning has never, ever in the history of science revealed anything true and interesting about how the universe actually works. Let's examine why. First, the idea that everything must have a cause may seem obvious, but it's not a universal principle. It's a generalization from within the universe, not necessarily of the universe. Can we truly say the universe itself must have a cause? After all, what caused quantum fluctuations? What caused time? What caused causality? These may not be questions that logic can answer. Second, we can easily imagine logically consistent universes that don't require a God at all. Imagine a universe with just one particle, moving according to Newtonian mechanics. No life, no meaning, no purpose. Is that any less real? Or consider a universe governed entirely by the Schrödinger equation of quantum physics. No divine mind needed, just math, just rules. Third, The famous principle of sufficient reason, which says everything must have a reason, is not a law of nature, it's a philosophical assumption. And assumptions, in science, must be tested, not taken for granted. So when we treat the passive God like a theory, it doesn't give us new data, make predictions, or simplify our understanding of the cosmos. It becomes, at best, an optional decoration. One of the more modern attempts to justify God as a cause is the Kalam cosmological argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This sounds powerful, until we consider that the first premise, again, is an empirical statement, not a logical necessity. In fact, quantum mechanics suggests that things may happen without identifiable causes, like the spontaneous appearance of virtual particles in a vacuum. Moreover, the second premise, the universe began to exist, is hotly debated. The Big Bang was not necessarily the beginning. It was a transition point, a limit of our current models. There may have been time before time, or a cosmic bounce, or an eternal inflation field. Point is, we don't know. And invoking God doesn't help us know more. It just fills the gap. And in science, filling the gap with mystery is not an explanation, it's a placeholder. Let's move now to a very different kind of God, the active God. This is the God of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and many other faiths. This God is not passive. He creates the world for a purpose. He gives moral commands. He performs miracles. He judges. He loves. This kind of God makes empirical claims about the world. And so, if we're honest, this kind of God should be testable. That's not a criticism. That's an opportunity. If God created the universe, designed life, and intervenes in human history, we should expect certain fingerprints. We should expect evidence. So what does science say? Let's take a look at 4 domains where God is often invoked. Motion, life, consciousness, the origin of the universe. And we'll evaluate. Does invoking God help us explain these phenomena better than science can? Let's begin with one of the oldest mysteries humans confronted. Why do things move? In the ancient world, thinkers like Aristotle believed motion required a mover. If a rock rolls, someone must have pushed it. If the stars circle the heavens, some force must guide them. Hence the idea of a prime mover, an uncaused cause, took root. But in the 17th century, a quiet revolution happened. His name was Isaac Newton. Newton's laws showed that objects in motion don't need an ongoing cause, they simply obey the principle of inertia. Unless acted upon by a force, motion continues. This upended the theological idea that the universe needed continuous divine propulsion. Suddenly, natural laws were enough. And even further, the conservation of momentum and energy, explored by Galileo and others, gave the universe a kind of autonomy. Motion, it turned out, didn't need miracles, it needed math. So in the case of movement, the active God was scientifically replaced, not disproven, but rendered unnecessary. Next comes life. Surely the complexity of DNA, the elegance of the cell, the sheer improbability of biological systems must imply design, right? This intuition has fueled arguments for a divine designer for centuries. From William Paley's watchmaker analogy to modern-day intelligent design movements, many believe life must come from life. But science tells a different story. Darwinian evolution provides a robust, testable, and predictive framework for how life evolves over time through natural selection acting on random variation. The discovery of DNA, genetic drift, epigenetics, and the deep fossil record further strengthens the model. Moreover, abiogenesis research, while incomplete, has shown plausible pathways for life's basic building blocks to emerge from non-living matter under early Earth conditions. It's not all answered, but progress is being made without invoking a supernatural designer. And when compared to the God hypothesis, evolution has 3 scientific advantages. It makes clear, falsifiable predictions. It has overwhelming supporting evidence. It doesn't assume what it tries to prove. So once again, the active God doesn't offer more explanatory power than existing science. Of all the phenomena in the universe, consciousness may be the most mysterious. It is private, subjective, unquantifiable in a strict sense. We know what it's like to feel joy, pain, curiosity, but we can't point to a particle of thought, a pixel of soul. Surely this must be where God enters. Right? But even here, neuroscience is advancing rapidly. Researchers have identified brain structures responsible for decision-making, emotion, memory, and awareness. Disorders of consciousness, such as coma or vegetative states, reveal that consciousness correlates with measurable brain states. Moreover, altering the brain alters the mind, through injury, drugs, or disease. This doesn't disprove the soul, but it strongly supports the idea that consciousness emerges from physical processes, not divine magic. Once again, God becomes a gap filler, not an explanatory principle. And in science, the gaps keep shrinking. Surely, if God exists anywhere, it must be at the beginning. After all, why is there something rather than nothing? This question has driven philosophers and theologians for centuries. In the 20th century, the Big Bang Theory transformed our understanding of cosmic origins. It revealed that the universe, as we know it, expanded from a hot, dense state about 13.8 billion years ago. But contrary to popular belief, the Big Bang was not necessarily the beginning of existence. It was the beginning of our current expansion phase. Several well-developed physical models suggest what might have preceded it. Eternal inflation, a field that expands endlessly, spawning pocket universes like bubbles. Cyclic cosmologies, in which the universe contracts and re-expands over and over. Quantum gravity models, where time and space are emergent, not fundamental. These models are speculative, but they're grounded in physics, not faith. And here lies the key. God, as a hypothesis, doesn't predict which constants should exist. God doesn't tell us how long the universe should last. God doesn't model the distribution of galaxies. Physics does. So while the God hypothesis leaves us with mystery, physical cosmology tries to leave us with math. But what about fine-tuning? The most powerful argument for God in the modern scientific era is not motion, not biology, not consciousness, but cosmic calibration. Physicists have discovered that the constants of nature, the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, the cosmological constant, are exquisitely fine-tuned for life. Change any of them slightly, and the universe becomes lifeless, chaotic, or collapses. For example, the cosmological constant, which drives the expansion of the universe, appears to be fine-tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the power of 120. That's like hitting a target the size of a proton on the other side of the universe. So the argument goes, if the universe is fine-tuned, and fine-tuning is unlikely to occur by chance, then there must be a tuner. And that tuner is God. Sounds compelling, but let's examine alternatives. There are at least 4 competing explanations for cosmic fine-tuning. It's just luck. The constants are random, and we just happen to exist in the 1 in a billion universe where life is possible. This feels unsatisfying, but it's logically possible. Anthropic selection. We shouldn't be surprised the universe permits life, because if it didn't, we wouldn't be here to ask the question. It's a kind of cosmic observer bias. Multiverse theory. There isn't just one universe. There are countless, each with different physical constants. In such a landscape, fine-tuning is inevitable somewhere, and we live in one of the somewheres. Divine design. God created the constants intentionally for life to emerge. So which explanation is best? To answer that, we need to ask, which one is supported by the most evidence and makes the fewest assumptions? Let's compare the 2 big contenders, multiverse versus God. To many, the idea of a multiverse sounds like science fiction. Infinite worlds? Unseen dimensions? Alternate realities? But in physics, the multiverse isn't a fantasy, it's a prediction. Several respected theories point toward the multiverse as a natural consequence. Eternal inflation theory predicts a constantly expanding background field that spawns countless bubble universes, each with different constants. String theory, with its extra dimensions and landscape of solutions, also implies a multitude of possible universes. Quantum mechanics, especially in the many worlds interpretation, suggests that all possible outcomes happen in parallel universes. None of these theories were invented to solve fine-tuning. They arise from attempts to unify existing physics. In other words, the multiverse is not a free-floating idea. It's an extension of models that already work. When science evaluates competing explanations, it doesn't just ask, which one feels right? It asks, predictive power. Does it make clear predictions that could, in principle, be wrong? Coherence. Does it fit with what we already know from well-established science? Simplicity. Does it add unnecessary assumptions? Explanatory scope. How much of the data does it explain? Falsifiability. Could an experiment or observation prove it wrong? Let's run the God hypothesis and the multiverse hypothesis through this checklist. The multiverse hypothesis makes some indirect predictions. If eternal inflation is true, we should see specific patterns in the cosmic microwave background. Certain distributions of galaxy clusters might match multiverse models better than single universe ones. Physics at very high energies, e.g. from particle colliders, could point toward theories like string theory, which entail a multiverse. These predictions are hard to test, but they're not impossible. The God hypothesis, by contrast, struggles here. If God is omnipotent, omniscient, and free to act as he pleases, what couldn't he have created? A small universe? A vast one? One with life? One without? A universe with evil? Without evil? All are logically possible under God. That flexibility makes the hypothesis hard to pin down scientifically, because it predicts everything and therefore nothing. The multiverse emerges naturally from physics we already trust, general relativity, quantum field theory, and inflationary cosmology. These theories have passed countless tests. God, as an explanation, often conflicts with scientific understandings, especially when tied to specific religious narratives that contradict cosmology, geology, or biology. This doesn't mean God is impossible, but from a strictly scientific standpoint, coherence favors the multiverse. Occam's razor tells us, don't multiply assumptions beyond necessity. Critics of the multiverse sometimes say, infinite universes? That's the opposite of simple. But in science, simplicity refers to the laws, not the outcomes. If a single, simple law generates many outcomes, that's still considered simple. Think about rolling dice. The rule is simple, throw and count. The number of possible results is vast, but that doesn't make the rule complicated. The multiverse says, simple physics leads to many universes. God says, a maximally complex, intelligent, conscious being designed one universe, which has fewer assumptions. For most scientists, the multiverse wins this round. Fine-tuning is where the God hypothesis shines most clearly, at least at first glance. God seems to directly account for life-permitting constants. But step outside fine-tuning, and problems emerge. If God designed the universe for life, why the enormous size? Billions of galaxies, trillions of stars, overkill if the goal is Earth. Why low entropy at the beginning? Life doesn't require it. Yet our universe started in an extremely special state. Why the vast majority of the universe is hostile to life? Why suffering, natural disasters, and predation? Why moral and scientific confusion in humanity? These are not decisive disproofs, but they weaken God's explanatory scope. The multiverse, meanwhile, handles fine-tuning without committing to a purpose. The constants are what they are in our universe because we happen to be in one of the universes where life can exist. No intent required, no contradictions introduced. The multiverse is hard to test, but in principle, certain signatures in cosmic radiation, particle physics, or gravitational waves could support or disconfirm it. The God hypothesis, as traditionally conceived, is not falsifiable. Any evidence, good or bad, can be interpreted to fit God's will. If life is rare, God chose it that way. If life is abundant, God wanted it that way. If there's suffering, it's part of His plan. If there's joy, it's His blessing. From a scientific perspective, this flexibility is a weakness. It turns God into an ever-shifting target. Philosophers call this the saving moves problem. When evidence doesn't match a hypothesis, we can abandon the hypothesis, modify it to fit the new evidence. The God hypothesis often survives by modifying itself endlessly. God created the universe for life, except for all the parts where He didn't. God loves us, except when He allows disasters we don't understand. God gave us clear guidance, except when it's vague, ambiguous, or contradictory. This makes God difficult to treat as a scientific explanation, because instead of predictions driving belief, belief drives the predictions. Before we conclude, let's briefly return to the third concept, the emergent God. This is God as love, as natural law, as the universe itself. In many ways, it's immune to critique, because it's not really a hypothesis about reality's mechanics. It's a metaphor, a poetic framing. Science has no quarrel with metaphor. But metaphors don't win scientific showdowns. So in our analysis, the emergent God simply isn't competing. At this point, the scoreboard, purely on scientific grounds, leans toward the multiverse as the more promising explanation for fine-tuning. But science is not the only way of knowing. Philosophy, theology, and personal experience operate in different domains. God may not be the best scientific explanation, but could still be the best existential one. Because there's a critical truth here. Science can tell us how the universe works. It can even suggest why certain patterns emerge. But the deepest, why is there anything at all? That's still open territory. The multiverse doesn't remove mystery. It just relocates it. If there are infinite universes, why is there a multiverse at all? Why do the laws that generate it exist? Why does mathematics map to reality? These meta-questions remain, and may always remain, beyond empirical reach. Here's a twist. What if God and the multiverse aren't rivals at all? What if God uses the multiverse, creating a vast landscape of universes, each with its own constants, because he values diversity, creativity, or infinite exploration? This view keeps God in the picture without reducing him to a fine-tuner who had to get the constants just right. It turns him into the author of the entire library of possible worlds. Philosophically, it's appealing. Scientifically, it's untestable. But it shows that even when science challenges certain concepts of God, it doesn't erase the idea entirely, it reshapes it. So here's the careful, scientific verdict. As a scientific theory explaining fine-tuning, the multiverse is currently stronger than the God hypothesis, because it fits with established physics, offers indirect testability, and doesn't suffer from predictive vagueness. As a philosophical or theological idea, God remains untouched by these critiques, because he can be redefined to operate outside scientific constraints. But we must not conflate the two. Science can analyze God as hypothesis. It cannot sell God as faith. The problem arises when the two are confused, when faith-based claims are presented as scientific conclusions, or when science is demanded to adjudicate on matters it's not built to handle. We began with a question. If God was a theory, how would it stand against the multiverse? The answer: in the realm of physics and cosmology, the multiverse is the more scientifically viable explanation for the fine-tuning of our universe. But science's victory here is not the death of God. It's the death of one specific way of thinking about God, as a necessary physical hypothesis for why the universe is the way it is. What remains is the God of faith, of meaning, of personal experience, and for many, that's the God that matters most. So perhaps the real challenge is not God versus the multiverse. It's our own capacity to live with uncertainty, to admit where we know, where we guess, and where we simply wonder. After all, the universe, whether crafted by divine hand or blind physics, is still awe-inspiring beyond measure. And maybe awe is the closest we'll ever get to touching the infinite.